we're ready to start now, member. Welcome to this meeting of the Standard and General Purpose Committee. We're now live streaming on YouTube. My name is Councillor Andy MacLeod and I'm the chairman of the committee. I'm accompanied by my vice chairman, Councillor John Meaning. We're not in our usual place tonight. We're normally in the council chamber, but because of technology problems, we moved into committee room 1. To help members of the public who may be watching, I'd like to ask everybody just to introduce themselves by going round the table, if I may.
Yes, John Malone, ward councillor for Alsted and Pepperrow.
Joan Hegan, co-opted member from Godalming Town Council.
Michael Goodrich, councillor for Bramley and Warner.
Peter Nicholson, a member for Hazelmere East.
Paul Follows, leader of the council. I'm not a member of the committee, but as ever, observing.
John Ward, councillor for Recklesham and Rowledge.
Susan Sam, executive head of Legal and Democratic Services.
Kitty Smith-Shalmain, senior governance officer. I'm Bailey Mansour, I'm a democratic services officer.
Thank you. There's also a lady online. If you could introduce yourself, please, Jane.
Hello, my name is Joan Juniper. I'm Joan Holroyd, sorry, and I'm co-opted from Elstead Parish Council. Thank you.
We also have somebody who's going to be speaking later, Jerry.
Yes, I have indicated to speak on a couple of items, and Councillor Jerry Hyman, Farnham Firgrove Ward. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we actually go into the meeting, it's been pointed out to me by Susan Sale, the monitoring officer, that we haven't been strictly speaking applying the council's constitution in terms of speaking. In fact, we've been allowing people to speak by putting them down their name by 12 o'clock on the day of the meeting. That's not strictly correct, actually. Susan had advised me that members should actually, if they have a question to ask, they should do it 4 days in advance. And they should only really speak on urgent matters. But we're going to allow discretion today. So Jerry will be allowed to speak as has been the normal practice. And also I'll be inviting Paul Follis to speak, actually. Specific reason is because he's a member of the Joint Constitution Review Group. And all of the items we're considering tonight are actually have been looked at by the review group. And Paul was part of that meeting and part of the 2 meetings. There's one meeting held here on the 30th of November, and there's a subsequent meeting in December at Godalming. And that review group has got 4 members of this committee on it and 4 members of the Godalming committee. In fact, Paul is a member of the committee, even though he's not the subgroup, even though he's not a member of the committee. So let's get into the subject of the meeting. The first 4 items we're going to be discussing are going to be the ones that were actually reviewed by the review group meeting here in Waverley. And the next 4 items will be the ones that were reviewed at the Godalming meeting. So if I can pass over to Susan to introduce the first item, which is the revised terms of reference for the Joint Governance Committee. Oh, sorry, before I do all that, there are various other things I have to do. If I can ask Blair to report if there's any apologies for absence.
I've received apologies from Councillor Janet Crowe.
And if I ask members to confirm that they're happy with the minutes of the previous meeting, which were published on the council's website, are all members happy with the minutes of the previous meeting?
Great.
Thank you. And I asked Blair to report if there have been any declarations of interest.
None received.
Any questions from members of the public?
Again, none received.
Any questions from members of the council?
None received.
Right, thank you. Let's now move into the first item 6. And if I ask Susan to introduce that item, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So this relates to the Council's Joint Governance Committee, which is a joint committee under Section 101 of the Government Act with Guildford Borough Council. It was established in 2022, and its primary purpose is to consider matters around the collaboration. So in particular, it's on a regular basis and considers the risk register for collaboration and also the interoperability agreement between the 2 councils for their partnership working. We've taken the opportunity to review the terms of reference of that committee, primarily because there has been an additional inter-authority agreement entered into relating to the council's earlier decision about temporary staffing being shared on a temporary basis with Guildford. In terms of the review of the terms of reference, we have reduced the number of members needed to form a quorum of the meeting because it was excessively high. And we have just added on some general provisions about the committee's power to delegate and committee's power to create subcommittees, etc. Other than that, and the terms of reference now include all of the inter-authority agreements and their regular reviews. Other than that, the changes are very minor. There's nothing else really to bring your attention to, Chair, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. And any members of the committee like to comment at all? As I said, this item has been fully discussed by the review group, and the recommendations that were before you are actually have been agreed by that review group. And these are the recommendations that will be put to the full council. But members here have every right to actually consider the item fully and put forward their comment. If there's any members of the committee who wish to comment on this item of the recommendations before us. No one.
Can I just endorse what the officer has said? But to me, it's common sense. There's only been a few minor alterations, and I see no problem at all. It's been through the proper process, and I would have thought it was just a matter of passing it tonight.
Okay. Have you any comments, Paul, that you wish to make?
No, it's a fairly straightforward matter. I think the main one about the quorum of the quorum number of the committee was the only bit that caused any real debate, and that's really just to make sure that nobody's dragged over to the other side of Guildford or Waverley for no reason. So it's to ensure the meetings take place and we don't waste officers or members' time.
Okay. Well, the recommendations are all in the papers in front of you, and I don't think I really need to read them out, and we're all happy with them. So are we happy that these recommendations go to the full council? I think they'll be come forward at the next proper meeting of the full council. There's an extraordinary meeting and before that. But at the next meeting of the full council, the recommendations before you will be put to the full council. So we're all happy to do that.
They actually are going to the extraordinary.
They're going to the extraordinary.
Oh, they're going to the extraordinary. I didn't understand.
The one after that's the budget, so nothing else can go to it.
Oh, they can't go to the budget meeting, so they'll go to the extraordinary meeting.
So 25th.
Okay. So are we all happy with that?
Agreed.
Great, good. Well, I can now ask Susan if you can actually introduce the next item, which is the revised officer employment procedure rules.
Jack.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So this is officer employment procedure rules which relate to the employment arrangements for senior officers within the council. So there is legislation, the Local Authority Standing Orders Regs, which sets out specific arrangements that need to be applied to both the recruitment and appointment, but also any potential dismissal of senior officers. Those regs apply to what we call chief officers and deputy chief officers, and also the council's 3 statutory officers. So chief officers are, in summary, are those that report direct to the chief executive. Deputy chief officers, in summary, are those that report to chief officers. So for Guildford and Waverley's purposes, it's effectively the joint management team. It's that a group of 16 members of staff that these rules would apply to. Currently, Waverley doesn't have any such rules within their constitution. They obviously have the Joint Appointments Committee, which has terms of reference, but they don't have the accompanying procedure rules that set out the detail as to how we recruit and appoint or potentially dismiss these types of officers. There are a set of procedure rules produced in your papers, which deal with those requirements. And in particular, the occasions when the Joint Appointments Committee is involved in recruitment, as opposed to the head of paid service and his delegatees, and also occasions when the Joint Appointments Committee can only make a recommendation and that full council reserves the decision-making power. So, for example, with statutory officers, you will have seen in the past, I'm sure, that the Joint Appointments Committee will deal with the recruitment process, deal with the interviews, but their decision is to come up with a preferred candidate, and it must be a resolution of full council to consider their recommendation and make any designation rather to a statutory officer role. I would also point out that the terms of reference for the Joint Appointments Committee have also been reviewed and updated, primarily because they currently the terms of reference only deal with appointment and not dismissal. Clearly, we hope that you're never in a position where you will be considering a dismissal of a senior officer, but if you were to, it's particularly important that your procedures are transparent and fair and clear. So it's also proposed that the name of that committee changes, so rather than it just referring to appointments, that it would be the Joint Senior Staff Committee, and it would have within its terms of reference both appointment but also dismissal. And I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Susan. On this occasion, we've got Jerry Hyman's put his name down to speak. So, Jerry.
Chairman, yes, thank you very much indeed. I've got a few issues which are typos. I did speak to the committee services earlier on in this respect, and I wasn't able to take the time off this afternoon to be able to put them all into writing. It was in the report that was a late report that came out, so I hadn't had a chance to look at it last week or anything, obviously because we hadn't seen them. But if you like, I'm happy to leave it until after other members have spoken, because they might well cover some of the points.
Okay. Does any other member wish to speak in this item? Councillor Goodrich.
Yeah, I'm on the joint committee anyway, so I've been through it once, but I read it again today. And one thing that occurred to me, we refer in the Officer Employment Procedure Rules to the proper officer quite often, but it's not appear in the definition at the front. And it just occurred to me, would that be helpful?
Susan.
Through you, Chair. I think not actually, because there is a whole section in the Constitution that sets out who the proper officer is for different roles. So proper officer is a term that's used in legislation quite frequently. And for different purposes, it may be a different person within the council that is the proper officer for that purpose. So there is a schedule with the scheme of delegations that sets out all the proper officers. And if we were to include who it was in each procedure rule within the Constitution, there is a risk of things becoming out of date if something changes. So I think the preference is to keep that proper officer list up to date, and in other documents just to refer to whoever the proper officer at the time is.
If I come back, would it be preferable then to say under the definition clause, referring people to the other part of the Constitution, so that someone reading this knows easily where to refer to find what we mean by proper officer?
Yeah, I think that's very, very
Because
helpful,
we have
Chair.
to find everything else very obviously.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful
So
comment,
you're
so
happy to-
I'll make that amendment to make
I think it
reference
would
to
be an
part.
improvement if we did that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nathan. Any points from other members? Paul, do you wish to comment on this one?
I was only going to also add the same thing, because most of us will have only heard proper officer in respect of our town clerks, where we're members of those sorts of authorities, where we hear that phrase most of the time. Other than the fact that we now have to learn another acronym, which is always a treat, this is obviously a sensible change to the away from the Jack to the new version, so it's necessary. So thank you, Chair.
Okay. Jerry, very helpful, Jerry, if you've got some advice on typos and things. It's probably best to take that after the meeting, but is there any other points you wish to make, Jerry?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, indeed, yes. And I thank Councillor Goodrich for raising that, because that's one of the points I did raise earlier on, and it was said it would get through, and obviously Susan had the chance to look at that and consider it, so that she had the answer for you ready, which is nice. We've got I did also mention that there's an issue here, I think, with the name that's proposed of the Joint Senior Staff Committee. To any normal person, and certainly a councillor, I think a staff committee might imply could lead to confusion. And I think staffing would be a far better word to use, just adding ing to it, because it's about staffing. It's not a staff committee, and we just want to avoid any confusion. So if members think that staffing would describe it far better, which I think it would, because obviously it's not just appointments now, as Susan did say, it's also about disciplinary action and dismissal, and of course also the prior to appointments, the selection process as well. So I think staffing, rather than put in lots of words of employment and all the rest, and there's lots of things you could call it, but I think staffing better than staff if you want a helpful suggestion. I'd also like to point out that at the top of on page 5 of the supplement, the recommendations at 2.1, 2.2 and 2.4. 2.1 is a recommendation to note, which is superfluous, and that should not be in there. We don't want to waste time putting recommendations to council that mean nothing and should have been deleted. 2.2 it's just got an issue of with singular or plural here with full councils and constitutions, because we're only dealing with one, ours, so it's singular. 2.4 says it repeats the phrase of recommend it to full council. Delete one of the two sets of words so that it's tidy and read sensibly. And in 3 and 4, the difference between reasons and purpose, section 3 and section 4 of the report a bit further on. We've got reasons and purpose, and there doesn't seem to be any reason or purpose why they're separated as they are. So members might like to just ask that that's cleared up in future. I think I can put these, because as long as I'm not asking questions, I don't have to nominate on the day. I'm pretty sure our constitution says we can notify to speak by 12 o'clock on the day, but it's questions that have to be put in advance at the day earlier. Anyway, on page 7 at 7.2, Chairman, members do need to know.
Actually, otherwise we'll lose track and you can make further points, but considering respond to the points you made already, because you made quite a few. Right.
Okay, right. Well, the first one, yes, was that there's the staffing, the issue of staffing. The second one is just the tidying up of the recommendations. So if you want to quickly whip through those with members and ask for members' views on that, I'd appreciate that.
On your first point, I didn't feel confused actually, because there is a committee of senior officers, which is called the Senior Management Committee. I can't remember the exact title of it. What you seem to be concerned about is that this could be regarded as a committee of the officer. I don't think that is going to confuse anyone, because there already is a different title for that. But I'm not too bothered about what's called staff committee or staffing committee, but I don't really think there is confusion about that. But Susan, you answer.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So in terms of the title, your officers advising you didn't feel there was confusion on that point. Yeah. It is a committee to deal with senior staff matters. I guess you could call it senior staffing. I don't feel particularly strongly either way, but the one point I would say is that because this is a joint committee, it depends on the decision that Guildford make as well. And Guildford are also being recommended to establish a committee called the Joint Senior Staff Committee. Yeah. If you were to be recommending anything else, it would need to be subject to the agreement of Guildford colleagues, because as a joint committee, it can only have one name. In terms of some of the other points that were raised, I accept and apologise that it should say constitution rather than constitutions in 2 of the recommendations. The first recommendation, 2.1, which says note to the report, I think that is a valid recommendation to have before you this evening, because we are asking you to give consideration to the report and you're invited to give any comments upon it. I don't feel there's any valid criticism on how the recommendations are set out actually, or any changes that are necessary. I think Councillor Hyman also picked up the point that we have a paragraph on reasons and also a paragraph on purpose. I would say that that's the standard template document, that is our report template that we use for all committee reports. And I hope it's clear the difference between the two provisions. He also raised the issue of speaking, and I think actually the agenda does make it very clear that to raise questions, it says on the front page of the agenda by December, I haven't got the date handy, but by the member questions must be raised by 26th of December. And it's paragraph 11.3 of the Constitution that makes provision for members to be able to ask questions at committee meetings, and it provides 11.3a that they must give at least 4 clear working days notice in writing of the question, or if the question relates to an urgent matter not already included on the agenda and they have the consent of the chair, then and the content is provided by noon on the day of the meeting, it can be asked. So for questions on the day, it must be an urgent matter not relating to something on the agenda, and the actual question must be provided. So simply giving the committee services team notice that you want to ask a question is not sufficient. I'm not aware of any other power under the Constitution for members to raise such questions, but I do accept, Chair, as we discussed earlier, it has been practice and protocol that a lot of chairs have used their discretion to have flexibility around that and allow people to speak, which you are doing this evening.
No, thanks for that, Susan. I think there has been a general feeling in the council that there's a generic right to speak at meetings if you put down notice by 12 o'clock in the day, and you're advising us that that isn't actually proper procedure. I don't know if you wish to comment on this, Paul.
Oh, no. I mean, I always enjoy these because, I mean, a lot of us have taken those things as read without clearly having read what it says. So that's interesting. No, just in terms of the comments that Councillor Hyman made, Godalming Town Council has a staffing committee, which is one of the only reasons that it pricked my ears as well. But I didn't find it a confusing name that made me think it was something it wasn't. So from that point of view, other than that, though, Susan has obviously covered everything. It's they're dealing with 2 different recommendations. There's a minor typo, but it's a typo.
I mean, it is a valid point that Susan's made, actually, that these recommendations are going to go to the Guildford Council as well as the Waverley Council. And if we have to insist on changing this recommendation to a different name, we'd actually have to defer that and not put it to Waverley.
Yeah, that can be done. No, that shouldn't be.
It can be done.
So,
if it's an important enough point.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's an important enough point that we want to go back through the procedure to the joint review groups and then change the recommendation from both Guildford and to Waverley.
If I may ask the monitoring officer a question through you, Mr. Chairman, if that were to happen, I imagine the most expeditious approach would be to put an amendment forward at both full councils to that effect, rather than going back through the whole chain. But again, I would agree with you that it's fairly minor, and we would only use that for something quite serious that would somehow all missed.
Okay.
But Chair, just through you to answer that point, absolutely, you shouldn't feel as a council that you can't make your own decisions and that you are beholden to the decision at Guildford. If you did want to change something that was in the joint arena, my advice would probably be that you make a recommendation to council that they change the name subject to Guildford's agreement, or without that agreement, that you then go back to the stage.
That's good, because I was worried that for every small change we'd have to go back to the whole procedure again, which wouldn't be a very good idea. Okay, so are members of the committee happy with what Susan said so far? Jerry, do you have any subsequent point to this to make?
Right, but thanks, Chairman, because actually, as Councillor Ward, I'm sure he's there, will recall, we did have a right to put in questions and to make statements or ask questions up till 12 noon on the day, because under his leadership that was changed to asking questions the day before. It was a specific measure he'd looked for because of the difficulty of staff answering questions on the afternoon in between 12 o'clock and the meeting at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. So other members will, I'm absolutely certain, remember that we did have a right to ask. It must be somewhere else in the Constitution.
Questions, not members' questions.
Yeah.
Members' questions in advance is always, that's a separate matter altogether that Susan was referring to, which is our right to put in written member questions. Of course, the public have a greater opportunity to speak than we do, because they can ask informal questions at meetings and we're not allowed to. So they've got greater rights than councillors, in fact, and we ought to sort that one out one day. But that's by the by, we're not looking at that issue. But there are some important matters which
we don't want to make this whole meeting about changing.
No, if I can carry on, Chairman, please.
So if we can get back to the items to do with this committee.
There is an issue here.
We'll take the issues separately from this meeting.
There is an issue here, Chair. Okay, sorry, but if I may get on, otherwise we will take all night. The monitoring officer has advised that it may be, or people have thought that it may be a problem getting this in front of Guildford. I don't think Guildford have got this. They haven't got a standards meeting till the end of the month, and I don't think they've got this on their agenda because they've already got one of their own. They've already got the a policy of their own or something. That might have been item 7 that I'm thinking of in that case, but. I don't think it's a problem with them because their meeting isn't tonight. It's going to be of standards, the equivalent. It's going to be, I think, in the 25th or something like that, and it's going to be. And I'm not sure it's got this on the agenda. Anyway, this is quite important. I think on page 20, paragraph 3.1, Chairman. It says that each council's responsible. It must appoint the chief executive officer before the offer is made. We can't really appoint an officer. We can't make the decision before an officer is made. I think what we do is delegate to an officer, probably the proper officer, to make the offer. Don't we? And actually, it's Waverley, not Guildford, that employs the our senior management, the joint senior management team. I don't know whether I wasn't aware that that's what we'd agreed back in April 22, but it is apparently. And I've checked the minutes, and I haven't seen anything, but it says in the report here that that's what we agreed to. That Waverley is the employer, and that means there's issues here of. Whether we should be making the decision legally, and Guildford should be making the with Guildford's agreement, with Guildford's prior agreement to it. I think that's something which we need to look at quite closely.
Can we allow Susan to answer that? Can I say, Jerry, your 4 minutes is more than enough, actually.
Well, I did think that other members might have looked through it and picked some of these things up, Chairman, and it doesn't help.
If we agree with it, we haven't read it. Okay.
Would you like to answer Jerry's point about Guildford?
Yes, I think Councillor Hyman's raised 2 points in that. Firstly, about when an offer can be made to a statutory officer. What tends to happen in practice is that after a joint appointments committee, when there is a preferred candidate, very often a provisional offer may be made, or a conversation advising the candidate that they are the preferred candidate. And most people applying for senior roles in local government appreciate the process, that a firm offer cannot be made until after the council meeting and the resolution has been made. So I think candidates generally expect to hear that they are the preferred candidate, and then they need to assess the risk, if any at all, of that not being endorsed by full council. So that's why an offer of employment is not made until after the council resolution. In terms of the issue around Guildford and Waverley, Councillor Hyman makes a good point that, of course, Waverley is the employer, and it would be Waverley who is entering into an employment contract with that individual. But because the person would be employed to provide a joint service and a joint role to both authorities, we've taken the pragmatic view that really the decision to recruit that person and appoint that person should be made by both authorities. The other point is that this isn't just an appointment. So, for example, if you take the role of the chief executive at Waverley and Guildford, our practice is that the chief executive is also the head of paid service. That doesn't have to happen, although most local authorities do it that way. You can appoint somebody to be chief executive. That is a contract of employment. the role of head of paid service is actually a formal designation rather than an appointment. So the law says that the council must designate them. This individual would be the head of paid service for both Guildford and for Waverley, and therefore Guildford must also formally designate them to be their head of paid service. So it does need to go to both councils, despite the fact that only one is the employing authority.
Okay. Thanks for that, Susan. Are there any other members of the committee, any points they wish to make on what Susan's just said?
Yeah.
We're happy with that. Okay. I think we have to move on and thanks for your comments, Jerry. Move on to the next item.
Is
Which is item number 8. We're up to that.
Chair, just agree with that.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for keeping me right. Because of the twos and fro's, I forget exactly where I am. We now have to agree the recommendations that are in your papers actually. That we're going to put to the full council. And I don't think I need to read them all out. Susan has summarised what they are. They include the change of the name of the committee and so on. So are we happy with the recommendations set out in the paper?
Subject to putting in the definition of proper officer and notifying Guildford of that and whatever procedure we have to go through.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you for that, Michael. Yes. So are we all happy with the recommendations?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay. Let's move on then to item number 8. And again, ask Susan to be good enough to introduce us to us.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the next item on your agenda relates to the key decision threshold at Waverley. So the Constitution currently provides for a key decision to be £100,000. Now, a key decision is something that has been set out in statute, and it is the threshold at which an executive decision is considered to be particularly significant. So a decision can be significant either in terms of its financial limit, whether that's expenditure or income or savings, or also significant in terms of its impact. So if it affects 2 or more wards within the area, then it would also be deemed to be a key decision. The threshold at Waverley, as I say, is £100,000. It's been that level for several years and not been reviewed for some time. It now appears to be out of sync, both with neighbouring authorities, but also in terms of our population and our total budget, it seems to be particularly low. So we've taken this opportunity of reviewing it, and we are suggesting that it's increased to £200,000. By coincidence, really, rather than design, that is also the same level that Guildford operate at as well, as do several of the neighbouring authorities. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Susan. Again, Jerry, you put your name down to speak on this item. Do you want to have any comments you wish to make?
Okay, yes, I'll go ahead now then, if that's okay. Yes, on page 26 of the main officer report that you've got there at paragraph 1.4, it says that the current threshold of 100 grand has remained at the current level for quite some time, and it's not changed with inflation or any funding received. And I can't see the relevance of funding received, and I don't know how long quite some time is, and I'd like to know, if possible, that might be for another time. I do think that when this is public information, this is going out to the public, and that just looks a bit too vague for our residents to be impressed with how accurate we are, or how we're justifying what we're doing, because this is a matter of how much money will it save and how much time will it save. It'll save a bit of executive time, I appreciate, but all councils are likely to go bust within the. Am I being interrupted? Sorry. No, okay.
Okay, carry on, Jerry.
All councils. I was read on some sort of news feed that comes through my computer, whether I want it or not. it told me that all councils are going to be bust in 3 years. And I thought, well, not necessarily all, because we might have enough reserves for a bit longer. But the point that they were making is probably right for most. And we should be seen to be tightening our decision making in respect of finances. Not loosening our belts, so to speak. And I'm just wondering whether this is the right time for us to be saying that we are going to be as loose as the looser ones, rather than, I mean, the councils that seem to be doing okay are the ones who are on the same amount of us at the moment from the list that's at the back of this lot. So I just wonder whether that was the question, whether it was something where, why are we loosening things up when we'd be expected to be doing the opposite? What's the justification? How long has it been, and what does funding received mean? The only other point I'd like to make is that on page 31 at Article 12, members will see that is, I referred to that in the meeting just prior to Christmas, and was told that doesn't exist. 12.2G. I was told that wasn't a relevant reason for a point of order. So I'd just like confirmation that is still there, and that we do have to consider all matters that were relevant. The case, of course, before Christmas was when the date when the chief executive is going to be joining us, and we still don't know that. So if we can clarify that, thanks very much.
Susan.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take those points one at a time. So Councillor Hine has asked about the length of time. I do agree with him that the expression quite some time in a committee report is not ideal. The reason that I can't be more specific is simply because we don't have records going back far enough for me to be actually able to check the date. I believe from colleagues that may have been around some years ago that it's approximately 10 to 12 years ago that it was last reviewed. I've heard 2011 mentioned. I've also heard at least 10 years. I think we keep our committee reports for 6 years, so I can't actually give you a specific date as to when it was last reviewed. All I can really say is that it was quite some time, and my professional advice is that it's due for a review, really. In terms of funding received, Councillor Hine has asked the relevance of that. I think the relevance is that we have tried to do some benchmarking against other authorities, and so we've considered the council's total budget figure, which obviously is impacted by funding that is received. So we've looked at the population and the size of the area, and we've looked at the general budget position and tried to compare that with other neighbouring authorities across Surrey. So that's why we thought it was relevant to consider funding that the council receives. But in actual fact, raising it to 2,000 is very much in line with other authorities, regardless of the budget position anyway. Councillor Hine is querying, I think, whether this financial climate is the right time to loosen control over finances in some way. I would really strongly emphasise that this does not in any way loosen your control over finances whatsoever. The thing that it would make a difference on would be that the law provides that a key decision should be on the forward plan and in the public domain for 28 days before the decision is made. So if more decisions were non-key, in theory, they wouldn't be in the public domain for that 28-day period. They would still be in the public domain for 5 days before the decision has been made. But that being said, Waverley actually errs on the side of greater transparency and puts all of their executive decisions on the forward plan in any event, regardless of whether they're key or not. So in practice, it doesn't reduce transparency in any way. It doesn't reduce the length of time for making decisions, and it certainly doesn't reduce your control on your finances or your decision making. And then the last point I picked up on was about Appendix 1 on page 31, about Article 12, decision making. It is Article 12 that defines what your key decision threshold is. So that's why that's included in this report, because that's the part of the Constitution that we're proposing is changed to increase the threshold. Councillor Hyman was referring to a point of order. Point of order is defined in paragraph 1413 of the Council Procedure Rules, so a very separate part of the Constitution, which governs the procedural rules about the conduct of a council meeting. That provides that a point of order may only relate to an alleged breach of the law or an alleged breach of the council procedure rules, i.e. just those procedure rules that govern the Constitution, not the articles of the Constitution, which are entirely separate. So the advice that I gave at the council meeting before Christmas was entirely correct, that a point of order must be about a breach of the law or a breach of the council procedure rules. A change to the articles has no consequence to that at all.
Thanks, Susan. Let's hear from other members of the committee, particularly about what they feel about the issue of raising the limit from 100,000 to 200,000.
Well, thank you, Chairman. No, I agree with this change. I think it's a good thing to do, and the points are well made. 100k has been around for some time. It's not been possible to say exactly, but it's a long time, and we've had quite serious inflation last year as well, which is not very good. As always, I like the table of comparisons. I also like this sort of stuff, and I think even with the raised level of 200k, we're still somewhere in the middle. So that's a nice place to be, and the whole thing will allow the council to be more efficient in its operation. So I fully agree with it.
Any other member wish to comment? Paul, would you like to comment?
So I just want to firstly support the inclusion of that table. I think that's really helpful. I think the correlation that Councillor Hyman drew there, frankly, was false. It's just not, that is not the reasons why those councils are in any kind of jeopardy whatsoever, is because they've got a slightly higher or lower limit on this particular threshold. That's a false correlation. There has only been a small period of deflation I think in this country in 2015. So we've had almost continuous inflation to some level or another over the last 10. So that the actual purchasing power of that 100,000 over that time has rapidly decreased. So making sure that we've upped it a little bit is probably sensible for that reason alone. And the other thing I want to just comment on in terms of governance, by having the same as Guildford, we are now not having officers need to do two different sets of things for two different councils. If you want things that will add to errors being made and issues happening, it's having two sets of different rules across two councils that are working together all the time. Harmonising exactly these sorts of things will actually make governance easier for our officers, and for that and many other reasons, I completely support what's being proposed here.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I sit on the Joint Constitution Review Group and we discussed this at length there, and I am very comfortable with this raise, but I also wanted to say how helpful the benchmarking table is, because it just gives some wider context, and I think that's helpful in endorsing that decision.
Woking expends nothing.
I think that's a this year thing, Michael.
Nothing of it.
That might be unique for its own reasons.
Yes.
Any, John?
I think this is a perfectly reasonable suggestion. We're not at the top of the poll. We are in a reasonable middle position along with our peers who are in expenditure, budgets and population. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and I'm quite convinced that it is the way forward.
Okay.
So I would certainly support it.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, as Gemma said, it was very thoroughly discussed at the review committee. You know, it is a doubling of the thing, but in terms of proportion, in terms of Jerry's point about councils getting into trouble, it's a fair point to make, but it's usually many tens of millions of pounds that are at stake when councils get into trouble, not 100,000 pounds. So I support this as well. Are we happy, therefore, to support the recommendation to the full council that this be increased? Do you want to say anything back?
No, agree.
You don't. You just agree.
Just agree.
You looked at that, we're just about to say something. Okay, so we agree to put that recommendation to the full council.
Agree.
Okay, thank you. So if we move on now to item number 9. We're now looking at the items that people that were discussed at the Guildford meeting. So the next three items we'll discuss at the Guildford Basin of the joint review group. So the next one is to do with pre-election publicity. And that was asked for Susan to introduce it.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So this relates to the pre-election publicity and decision-making policy. This is an area where Guildford and Waverley both have an existing policy and they are already aligned actually, which is great. It relates to the statutory period before an election. When an election is called, there is a period preceding that known as the pre-election period, when there are restrictions and limitations on the activities of a council aimed at not allowing political publicity in the run up to an election, which could influence the outcome of an election. The guidance is very clear that a council should continue with business as usual. So if it's just routine decision making, there should be no problem or no difficulty with council being able to carry on such matters. It's where things are exceptional or an emergency or very sensitive or political that the guidance is clear, those matters should be delayed. The current policy that has been adopted by both councils actually provides that we shouldn't have any of our routine meetings, including council executive and the non-regulatory committees, that we shouldn't hold them at all within that pre-election period. That's quite an extreme position to have taken, and in actual fact, it has the risk of raising some practical problems around decision making in that period. It would mean that you may go quite some time without having a scheduled meeting for one of these committees, which could in turn influence your ability to make decisions. For example, you may feel that where you need to make decisions, you may then end up using chief exec's urgency powers or something like that as an alternative, which isn't really the right method of making that decision. So what we are suggesting is that simply the policy is amended to provide more flexibility. We're very conscious that we have different types of elections in the borough as well, and that may determine how you interpret the statutory guidance. So for example, if it was a PCC election and we had something on the agenda that wasn't particularly politically sensitive, the council may take the view that it's okay to go ahead with such a meeting. If it was a borough election, we might be more sensitive. So we would just like more flexibility in that policy to ensure that we can continue with business as usual where it's appropriate to do so, still obviously taking account of the statutory guidance and taking that on board as well.
Okay.
So really the proposal before you is just to amend the wording in quite a minor way to give us more discretion to determine when such meetings are held and what business is on them.
Thank you, Susan. Is there any members of the committee that wish to comment on either in this edition? Oh, well, let's start with Councillor Beaton.
Yeah, thank you. I've had the answer to this, and thank you for getting it for me. I just raised the point that obviously in our ward, our new ward for the PPC, then we have East Hampshire as well as our own way of doing all the rest of it. And I just want to be assured there is a link between the two councils for the PPC on the general election to make sure that the further rules and all the rest of it are obeyed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. So a lot of our elections are cross-boundary now, but we have very close relationships with teams in those other councils. And if there was something on an agenda that we considered not to be politically sensitive, but could be to the neighbouring authority, and it was in that pre-election period, we would have that conversation and discussion with them. And we might in fact decide not to put something on our agenda because how it may impact a neighbouring authority.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Paul, you wish to say something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, this year's a really good year to do this, I think, because it illustrates some of the issues that we have. So without any definition of what type of election may cause these sorts of barriers, we could be in the position where we know for sure there are police and crime commissioner elections in May. So that's a bank of time where theoretically business would be impacted. But despite the fact that it is unlikely to be particularly relevant to that election, our business might be impacted. There might be a general election at the same time. There might not be, but there'll definitely be one before January. So that might be another completely separate bank of time where we're impacted. If there are any by-elections, again, without discretion for officers, there are theoretically areas where we're impacted. That's already quite a lot of the year where we're then restricted in doing what business we're doing. You add to that then the budget, where we add our own restrictions about what sort of business can come to council, at which point you end up getting quite a restricted timetable to do the ordinary business of council. So I absolutely support the idea that we give more discretion to officers to allow a sensible approach to prevail on this. I had a specific question about motions, however. Let's just say in a hypothetical scenario where a meeting was considered necessary to enact the business of whatever we were doing, and that was a regular business meeting. If we were in the pre-election period and somebody then decided to put a motion up, which would be their right to do on a meeting that would otherwise be happening, would you be able to restrict motions? So, for example, an exec is going to happen because, a council meeting is going to happen because we have business to do. It is otherwise a fairly neutral session. I then decide I want to put up 3 incredibly political motions because it's 2 weeks before an election. Is there anything that would actually stop me doing that? Because if it isn't, I think we need to restrict it.
It's a good question. I think there's nothing in the Constitution that would restrict that situation. So if something's on an agenda for an item, then for a meeting, then you could just bring a motion regardless of the content.
Yes.
But the statutory guidance around the pre-election period would provide that you shouldn't be behaving in a political way at any time, whether in a council meeting or not. So I think we could probably rely on the guidance to prevent the councillor acting really politically in the council chamber during that period. I wonder whether
I think
it might be prudent to include another paragraph in this
where I was
policy to
going.
cover that.
My suggestion would be a paragraph to suspend the sections on motions at the discretion of the monitoring officer during the election period. Or maybe if that's a bit strong, some wording that allows discretion on motions so that we don't have exactly that scenario. Because I don't think guidelines would be sufficient to stop a councillor doing that, really.
Yeah. I don't think you could stop motions per se. And
you
if
could
there
make
was
it
a
subject to
motion, you could
judgment.
stop amendments, but it might be useful to have a clause in here that there's some discretion for the chair and the monitoring officer, for example, that if they felt a motion was too political, that it could be left till the next meeting.
During pre-election period.
Yeah.
Michael wishes to know.
I just wonder on paragraph 8, page 50, bullet point, one could put business including motions would come under the discretion of the monitoring officer.
That would be an appropriate place to add it.
But I agree entirely with Councillor Holmes. What we don't want are motions just before an election.
Because don't get me wrong, I'm entirely the sort of person.
But it might be a
exploit
motion
that.
to say.
Yeah, that's right.
But it could be a motion that is, just a
It might be
very
necessary.
ordinary, sort of non-political,
Well, if I may, Mr. Chairman, a motion I put up before the last local elections in April, which was unanimously agreed by council at the time, was one in regards to voter ID. Now, that could have been seen to be controversial or not, as it was passed by all members. Arguably, it wasn't, but in theory, before the motion was debated, it was potentially. So that's the sort of thing I think that would fall within the discretion of the monitoring officers to determine if that was okay to do at that point in the election cycle or not. But I do think we need to have something in there that allows the monitoring officer to have that discretion, or it could be heavily abused.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that's a very, very valid point, that our agenda is restricted to avoid political things, but at the moment motions aren't, and motions should have the same restrictions on them as items on the agenda.
Yes.
And I'm sure the relevant wording can be worked that would link them and stop that happening. Although, of course, the more restrictive we get, if we want to be really restricted, we could have just one council meeting a year and lots of by-elections, and we could all go home.
Emergency powers for that one.
But seriously, I think this would be a very good thing, that the decision-making for motions should be the same as that for items on the agenda of a council meeting, and somehow I think some wording could be produced.
Sounds as if we're all agreed to this. I'll agree to this idea. How do we actually handle it now, Susan?
I think, Chair, if you're happy to delegate to me just to come up with the right wording,
Yeah,
would be useful rather than thinking on my feet now. But
Yeah.
I'm thinking that the suggestion that that paragraph highlighted is just expanded, I think is a really good idea. So that it would include business to be transacted, also motions, and also perhaps something around general conduct,
yeah,
which would be a bit of a catch-all in terms of other constitutional things that might happen in a council meeting, that they shouldn't be used to behave
Yeah.
deliberately, particularly if it's in a pre-election period.
I think we'd all be happy to delegate that to you, Susan.
I'll
In
make
terms
that
of, it
amendment.
doesn't actually change the recommendations as such, it's going to change some of the wording behind the recommendation. So how do we handle that in terms, again, what we discussed earlier, in terms of Guildford lining up with that?
That was the first thing I was going to ask as well, because it's
Yeah.
the first time we're doing this.
Yeah,
So that's absolutely fine. The papers for the Guildford meeting is going to their committee on the 18th, so they've not been published yet, have they? Quite?
so we can,
So I can make an amendment, but even if they have been published, I can update them verbally at the meeting
right,
and let them know what the outcome of this meeting has been and suggest that they also make the
Mm.
same change.
so you can handle that.
Absolutely. And again, of course, going back to that earlier point, Chair, if they don't agree to make that change, that would be fine. You could still have slightly different pre-election policies.
Yeah,
It's not like a joint committee that would be the same.
right.
But I think it's a really sensible point, so I'll be advising them to adopt that.
So if you'd advise them to do that, they're almost certain to do that. That will handle the problem. Okay. Any other points that people wish to make up? They bring up apart from that, very useful discussion we've had. Okay, so I subject to that, in these changes being made in the wording, are we all happy to agree the recommendations?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. So you get on my item 10, which is the proposed monetary officer protocol. Again, hand back to you. In fact, the monetary officer.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't think I'm conflicted in terms of being able to
Go
to you, but I'm happy to read it if I did.
Cutting off our noses by our face.
But yes, so the monitoring officer is one of the 3 statutory roles within a local authority. What that means is that every council must have one. It also means there is personal liability on the individual designated into that role, as there is for head of paid service under section 151. And it's for that reason that it's useful to have a protocol, I think, both to provide protection for the monitoring officer, but also to assist members in understanding what the role is and what some of the limitations on that role may be. So, for example, the monitoring officer is normally the primary legal advisor to the council, but that is a role to the council, not to individual members, for example, in terms of their personal legal issues. It's very much acting in the best interests of the council at all times. And the other thing that is stressed in this policy is very much that the monitoring officer role is politically neutral and impartial, whilst statutory officers may spend more time with the administration or the executive through the nature of the work. They are available to all members to offer advice to all members of all political parties and independents. And it's very important that their integrity about political impartiality is protected. So neither of the councils currently have a monitoring officer protocol. Personally, I think it's quite a useful thing to have adopted in your constitution. So it just sets out clarity for everybody about what the obligations of the role are, and also what the support that can be provided to members is and how to access it.
Okay. Thank you. Jerry, you put your name down to speak on this item again, so over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Chairman. Well, again, if you'd like, if other members wish to speak, first of all, I've got a few things to go through here. I mean, this is a very important matter, or shall I go ahead? Up to you.
Well, let's hear from other members first, and then we'll get back to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Chairman.
Any points from other members? Because you might want to comment what Jerry has to say.
Well, two things. On page 69, 6 bullet point down, to act as principal legal advisor to the council. That implies that the monitoring officer is legally qualified. Our previous monitoring officer was not. And I just query whether, I mean, obviously, prior to Susan's arrival, Robin was our monitoring officer, and he had the borough solicitor basically dealt with acting as the chief legal advisor to the council. I just query whether we are impliedly saying our monitoring officer's got to be a lawyer. I just raise it as a question.
Yeah.
It's a fair one.
Yeah,
Susan, over to you.
I think that's a really good point. Sorry, my experience has always been that a monitoring officer normally is a solicitor, but
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. It's not a requirement in any way. And it's perfectly possible that you could have an MO that's not legally qualified. I wonder if perhaps some wording that says the monitoring officer is responsible for providing the primary legal advice might allow that to be either themselves or via their deputy.
Yeah.
The borough solicitor is designated as the deputy
Yeah, that's what we
monitoring
had.
officer.
Yeah.
That would give a bit more flexibility. wouldn't it?
The borough solicitor did actually work for the report to the previous monitoring officer, didn't he?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The word
But he
says-
wasn't himself giving the legal advice to the council.
But that's a very valid point you're making, Monica.
Absolutely is.
So I think that wording needs to be tweaked.
Yeah.
So,
And I'm just to please Jerry,
Sorry.
it's page 69, under non-statutory functions, 5.2, 6th bullet point,
To act as principal.
says to act as principal legal advisor to the council.
Yeah.
That wording needs to be tweaked to
Yeah.
cover a non-legally qualified monitoring officer.
Hire a legally qualified one going forward.
Any comments from anybody else before we bring in Joe?
And then I had
Oh, you don't
a
have a
typo
comment.
to please Jerry on 6.3. I think it should start in some cases rather than in some case.
Yes.
6.3. Okay.
In some cases, for example, it should always be on the plural. Apart from that, I'm very happy.
Thank you, Michael. Any point, Paul, do you want to comment before Joe?
So just on all of this, I mean, one of the things that Susan's done, other than I think make sure that we've all actually not just sort of read a document called the Constitution, but we've all actually started to properly understand some of the things that it actually says and not some of the things that we think it all says. It has also highlighted some glaring gaps that once you see that this sort of thing probably should be there, you wonder where on earth it was in the first place for so long. This is one of those ones. Why on earth we've never had anything like this in our constitution? I have absolutely no idea. It definitely should be there. And yeah, with the suggestions that have been made, I obviously completely support its addition. We should have this. So I think also my limited experience of having done this for the last few years now, I think having a legally qualified monitoring officer is incredibly sensible to have. But as Mike has made clear, it isn't an actual requirement. So modifying it that way, totally sensible. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from anybody else before we bring in Joe? Over to you then, Joe.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I do thank Susan for all the work that's been done on this, because you're absolutely, or Leader's absolutely right. We definitely do need to have something like this. We've got a big issue come up, and which is obviously the post office scandal, where either they had an enormous problem of all sorts of people, 1,000 people all becoming dishonest all at exactly the same time, or they had a terrible recruitment failure, but everybody turned a blind eye to it, and a lot of people were defending themselves rather than doing the right thing, is the way someone put it that I heard earlier on the politics show whilst eating my lunch. This is really, really important, and I think it is worth looking at very carefully. Page 61, para 1.2 says we've got to ensure both councils have the proper procedures in place to discharge statutory obligations, and that must include members as well. We have to make sure the procedures are in place to discharge, so that we can discharge our obligations. As far as we're concerned, our council decisions can be challenged in the courts. That's plain fact. Members' decisions therefore have to be defensible in court or at appeal. And therefore we must be able to ensure the accuracy of the information that we're being given. And therefore the Constitution should, to enable that, include a process to ensure accuracy, truthfulness. Nolan principles we're also bound by in our code of conduct. Which means we need a duty of candour. I know that the leader and others have looked at that, and they know what it means, that we've got to disclose information whether it suits us or not to do so. Everything relevant has to be disclosed, and we've got to be honest with the court. So we've got to be honest in our decision making all the way through. But there's currently no checks and balances, no accessible route within what we've got in the Constitution or this to correct errant decisions or errant information from monitoring officers. And this isn't permanent. I refer to monitoring officers where I referred to Susan earlier. This is not personal. This is the monitoring officer role that we're talking about, regardless of who it is. So there's no way really to hold the monitoring officer and to account there. That's from what I can see of what's here. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. So I think we need to include right to a straight answer and have a register of questions and answers so that people aren't always asking the same questions over and over. Also paragraph 4 on page 68 at the second bullet. The monitoring officer nominates an external independent person. Now, obviously, as far as I can see, and I'm sure as any residents will see, this is not going to work if the monitoring officer is the subject of an investigation or has an interest themselves, because they're the person who's appointing the independent person. So I'm not entirely sure that we've got a system of checks and balances in by virtue of that paragraph 4 on page 68. It's been proven, it's a matter of public record, that the person system that we've got can go awry, and I can give you examples of which prove that. So as far as I'm concerned, although this is good, there's a lot of work been done. It doesn't work completely because the protocol still doesn't provide real practical checks and balances all the way through the system, which is what we need. I would like to thank Councillor Goodrich for raising those couple of points, which I hadn't picked up. So thanks very much for having detailitis too, and trying to make sure that we're doing things properly, Councillor Goodrich. and the next item I haven't indicated to speak on, but I do support it. Thanks.
Oh,
can I just say how emphatically I agree with a register of questions that have already been asked, so it can't be asked again. That's an absolutely wonderful innovation that I will absolutely take up. But now, just in case a couple of points, I do agree with the section. Perhaps we do need to amend it to say that in the event of perhaps the monitoring officer being the subject of whatever the investigation is, what I'm sure would happen in practice is the deputy monitoring officer would probably engage the independent person. I would certainly have no issue with this being amended to articulate that in the event of the monitoring officer being the subject of the complaint, that it be the deputy that put it in. But in practice, there is a whole mechanic. There's a whole mechanism for redress through the code of conduct system that exists to deal with this if you have a complaint. In terms of the duty of candour kind of requirement for honesty, I still have to go back to what I've said before, is that we have to trust people are telling the truth unless you've got good reasons to say otherwise. We have a scrutiny function that can bring in and scrutinise past decisions. And if there are areas where the scrutiny functions believe that they want to scrutinise a past decision, I continue again with some futility to urge them to do that, because they have that power. It's just not used. And to ask the questions at council that they are empowered to ask. I do think there are checks and balances in this system as far as there can be, and realistically, there's not a great deal more we can do. The real glaring omission in the United Kingdom is the inability to actually have any legal powers to prosecute councillors or others who might have been errant on this. In Wales, I think the structure is different, or is it in Scotland the structure is different, and you can actually prosecute councillors for the sorts of things that you're talking about, Jerry. But in England and Wales, it's pointless. So that for me is the gap, not this.
Michael.
Yeah, I would suggest on paragraph 4, first bullet point, at the end, after absence or illness, you add or conflict of interest.
Or conflict of interest, there we go.
Just add that in.
That's elegant.
I mean, I think would be an obvious thing, but put it in if it makes you feel happier.
Are you happy to make that amendment, Susan, in that way?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just thinking that through because it's actually the statute that says that a DMO has a power in absence or illness. But clearly in practice, if there was a conflict of interest, absolutely,
It's got to happen.
I wouldn't be, yes, so that would work to have that in. I mean, I would also add there that that's the reason that we have 2 deputy monitoring officers on our work, because being a joint head of service, there are occasions when you need to have 2 different hats between Guildford and Waverley.
Yeah.
So there will be issues where I ask my 2 deputies to deal with something so that they can be quite impartial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Any other points in this item?
Chair, can I just come back on a couple of points that Councillor Hyman made? I think he was suggesting that there's no check and balance in the system in respect of a monitoring officer. I've just come back to the overriding point that a monitoring officer is personally liable for the decisions they make. So ultimately, I take personal responsibility for any MO advice, and the council could take legal action against me in reliance on that.
Right.
So there is the ultimate check and balance in the system. And also, absolutely, if any conflict of interest, I wouldn't be acting, and that's why I have 2 very good deputies at Waverley and 2 at Guildford. And in respect of independent experts, I think Councillor Hyman was referring to the second bullet point of paragraph 4 about independent persons. Those independent persons are actually appointed by a full council. So if there is a concern about their integrity or honesty, that would be a council decision to consider who your appropriate individuals to act as your independent persons are. That's not within the remit of the monitoring officer. And also, I was just going to say that, the first bullet point, that it is a case that the monitoring officer designates the deputy monitoring officers. So the designation of the MO is a council decision. The appointment of the deputies is very much the MO's decision.
Yeah.
And that is right and proper because of this personal responsibility. So they should have choice as to who are their deputies to support that work. I mean, it almost in practice almost always is the legal services manager or borough solicitor or the correct role, but that is a MO appointment.
Okay. Any other points from any member of the committee? So we're happy to support the recommendation here.
As amended by the.
As amended by. And again, you will arrange for that to happen at the Guildford.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Then we're now on to the last item, which is the revised council procedure rules for extraordinary meetings.
Yes.
Again, pass to Susan to introduce this one.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So there's a really big piece of work going on at the moment with officers and with the Constitution Working Group around the council procedure rules, and they will all be coming to you hopefully in the March meeting that we're aiming for. We've broken them down and we're taking them one chunk at a time, and that's there are going to be some quite significant pieces changes to those procedure rules, and if they're approved, there'll be some training for all members, etc. But in the meantime, there is one particular rule that's causing some operational difficulties that we would like to bring to you as a standalone rule, so not in context of the other rules, and that's simply around the power to call extraordinary meetings, in that Waverley's constitution currently provides, at paragraph 3.2, that extraordinary meetings can only be used for one item of consideration. The agenda will be confined to a single item. That's not a legal provision in any way, and it is causing difficulties because we've had a couple of situations at Waverley recently where we've needed more than one extraordinary meeting. And you might recall a couple of months ago when we actually had 3 extraordinary meetings in the same evening because of this provision. So we would just like to have authority as soon as possible to amend that because we already are on notice there are a couple of matters coming forwards that might need extraordinary meetings. And other than that, all of the rules will be brought to you in March.
So are we actually going to make this amendment at the next extraordinary meeting?
Yes, so we're. So
Yes, it's got very meta.
Yeah, extraordinary meeting.
So does that mean that the extraordinary meeting will, until we make that amendment, will only be able to cover one item?
Yes,
Yes.
so in practice. So, for example, we believe that in January we will need 2 items because there may be a consideration of interim arrangements for the head of paid service. So your first item or your first extraordinary meeting will deal with this change. But unfortunately, because we have to publish our papers 5 days in advance, we will probably again have to hold a second meeting that evening afterwards.
That's why I
That'll
imagine
be the last
the
time.
changes couldn't happen to the next full council meeting.
Yeah.
So we're going to have 2 extraordinary meetings.
There will be 2.
The first one will change the extraordinary meeting rules.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then we'll have the
Then you
one
have an
about-
extraordinary that deals with everything.
Michael.
Yeah, well, it's all my fault. I
It is your fault. And it's all
Because
my
I
fault.
knew the constitution and had read it. And so I did raise it when we were going to put a second item on an
My
extraordinary
response
meeting.
was that.
And so we have a, so it's eminently sensible.
Yes.
So I'm not wishing to be difficult, but I was difficult because I thought we should follow the constitution previously.
No, there's nothing right. You do that because, as Paul said earlier, sometimes things can happen that are outside the constitution because everybody thinks that's the way things work. And they haven't actually fully read it. Oh,
And to be clear, my response was equally constitutional, and it's exactly to deal with those kind of somewhat the consequences of the decisions are not what we all intended. I mean, for anybody, there were a few people that weren't here. Michael pointed out that we weren't able to bring several things to an extraordinary meeting. My response was to ask the mayor to call 3 extraordinary meetings, one after the other, both of which were constitutional. Is not good for anybody. Certainly nobody watching it. It wasn't good for officers doing 3 sets of reports and minutes and all the rest of it. So this is eminently sensible just to deal with that particular issue.
absolutely. Any comments from anybody else? So are we all agreed then that we wish to make this recommendation to the next council meeting, which will be the next extraordinary meeting? Yeah. We've all agreed with that?
Agreed.
Okay, good. Well, I think that covers every item. I'd just like to say in conclusion, actually, that, you know, having read all these papers and so on, for not just for this meeting, but for the 2 review meetings, there's a tremendous amount of work that's been done in all this from Susan and her colleagues, actually. And they really worked very, very hard on it. And Susan in particular has brought up things that, you know, were really faults in the council's constitution and so on. And it's really good that that has actually happened. So I do want to say to Susan and her colleagues that they're doing tremendous work. There's still a lot to be done, by the way. There's still a lot to be done. But we're making very good progress in terms of what we're doing, actually. And I think this committee has worked well, and that we've, to my mind, we've sorted out the procedures for the planning committees, and that seems to be working well in practice. And I'm sure all this work will how the council will run. So thank you to you, Susan, and your colleagues. And in saying that, I have to close the meeting. So thank you all for your attendance for another good meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.